In the remote mountains of Kentucky, where the wilderness road carved its dangerous path toward the western frontier, there once stood an inn that travelers spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. Millbrook Inn, they said, offered something no other establishment could provide, a warmth that went far beyond clean beds and hot meals. 4 sisters ran this mountain sanctuary, and weary men would arrive as strangers but leave feeling like they had discovered something precious, something worth the treacherous journey back. The Cunningham sisters had a reputation that spread across 3 states. Merchants would delay their business trips just to spend extra nights at Millbrook Inn. Cattlemen would take dangerous detours through hostile mountain passes rather than miss the opportunity to experience the sisters' legendary hospitality. And those who had stayed there spoke of comforts that lonely travelers rarely found. Attention so personal, so intimate, that grown men would weep when it came time to leave. But in the winter of 1851, something changed. Travelers began arriving at settlements throughout Kentucky with disturbing tales. The road to Millbrook Inn, they claimed, had become littered with abandoned wagons and riderless horses. Local authorities dismissed these reports as frontier hysteria until a pattern emerged that could no longer be ignored. Dozens of men had vanished without a trace, and the last place anyone remembered seeing them was on the winding mountain path that led to the Cunningham sisters' welcoming door. Before we continue with the story of what really happened in those isolated Kentucky mountains, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love connecting with listeners from across the country who share my fascination with America's buried secrets. What authorities were about to discover would reveal that the warmth travelers found at Millbrook Inn came with a price far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The year was 1831 when Jeremiah Cunningham succumbed to consumption, leaving behind a thriving mountain estate and 4 daughters ranging in age from 16 to 26. Located in the remote highlands between Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and the Kentucky frontier, the Cunningham property sprawled across 800 acres of fertile mountain land, complete with livestock, grain fields, and most importantly, a strategically positioned inn that served travelers heading west on the wilderness road. Margaret, the eldest at 26, possessed the sharp mind of a born businesswoman and the cold, calculating nature that would later prove so deadly. Catherine, 24, had inherited their mother's ethereal beauty and an almost supernatural ability to make any man feel like the most important person in the world. Sarah, 22, shared her late mother's knowledge of mountain herbs and their various properties, knowledge that would prove far more sinister than anyone imagined. And Elizabeth, the youngest at 16, possessed an innocent charm that could disarm even the most suspicious traveler. The Cunningham estate had been built by their grandfather in 1798, when the wilderness road was little more than a dangerous trail carved through hostile territory. By 1831, it had evolved into one of the most respected stopping points for merchants, settlers, and adventurers heading toward the promise of Kentucky's bluegrass country. The main house, a substantial 2-story log structure with stone foundations, sat prominently on a ridge overlooking the valley below. The inn portion consisted of 6 comfortable guest rooms, a large common area with massive stone fireplaces, and a kitchen capable of feeding dozens. What made the Cunningham place special wasn't just its location or amenities. It was the reputation for hospitality that had been carefully cultivated over 3 decades. Travelers would speak in towns hundreds of miles away about the warmth of the Cunningham welcome, the quality of their mountain whiskey, and the comfort of clean beds after weeks on dangerous roads. Jeremiah had built something more valuable than gold: trust. The property employed a small but loyal staff. Ezra Hawthorne, a weathered mountain man in his 50s, had worked as foreman since the inn's early days. His knowledge of the mountains was encyclopedic, and his loyalty to the Cunningham family was absolute. 2 German immigrants, the Zimmer brothers, Klaus and Heinrich had arrived 3 years earlier, seeking work and stability in the New World. They lived in a cabin near the property's eastern boundary and managed the livestock and agricultural operations with Germanic efficiency. The autumn of 1831 marked the beginning of what locals would later remember as the inn's golden years. The sisters, initially working together out of necessity, discovered they possessed a remarkable ability to make guests feel not just welcome, but genuinely cherished. Margaret's business acumen kept the operation profitable. Catherine's charm kept guests lingering longer than planned. Sarah's knowledge of mountain cooking and medicinal teas enhanced their reputation for comfort. And Elizabeth's youthful enthusiasm made even the weariest traveler smile. But something darker was stirring beneath this facade of mountain hospitality. The isolation that had once protected the Cunningham family from the dangers of frontier life now provided something else entirely: privacy. And privacy, for 4 young women with sharp minds and few scruples, could be a dangerous thing indeed. It was a November evening in 1832 when Thomas Kellerman arrived at Millbrook Inn, and with him the first hint of the darkness to come. Kellerman was a cattle buyer from Richmond, traveling alone with a substantial purse of gold coins intended for purchases in Kentucky. He was a man of 45 years, recently widowed, with no children and few close ties. Precisely the type of guest the sisters would later learn to identify with terrifying precision. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow was beginning to fall when Kellerman's horse stumbled up the winding path to the inn. Margaret greeted him at the door with her practiced smile, noting immediately the quality of his clothes, the weight of his saddlebags, and most importantly, the loneliness in his eyes. A man traveling alone just 1 year after losing his wife was carrying more than just money. He was carrying a desperate need for human connection. "Welcome to Millbrook Inn," Margaret said, her voice carrying just the right mixture of professionalism and warmth. "I'm Margaret Cunningham, and these are my sisters. We'll make sure your stay is everything you need it to be." Kellerman's eyes brightened as he took in the warm glow of the common room, the smell of Sarah's venison stew, and the sight of Catherine arranging fresh wildflowers despite the season. This was exactly what a lonely widower needed. A place where beautiful, attentive women would treat him like family rather than just another paying customer. Over the next 3 days, the sisters provided Kellerman with an experience unlike any he'd ever encountered at an inn. Sarah's meals were restaurant-quality feasts, featuring perfectly seasoned game, fresh bread, and her famous honey cakes. Margaret engaged him in lengthy conversations about business and politics, making him feel intellectually valued. Elizabeth's innocent laughter at his stories made him feel worldly and important. But it was Catherine who provided what Kellerman truly craved: the illusion of romance. On his second evening, after the other guests had retired, Catherine found Kellerman sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames with the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. She approached with 2 glasses of Sarah's special spiced rum, each warming perfectly in crystal tumblers that caught the firelight. "You seem troubled, Mr. Kellerman," she said, settling into the chair beside him with fluid grace. "Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." For the next 2 hours, Kellerman found himself pouring out his heart to this beautiful woman who listened with such genuine attention. He spoke of his late wife, Mary, of their failed attempts to have children, of returning each evening to an empty house that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. Catherine listened with perfect sympathy, occasionally touching his hand or leaning closer with apparent compassion. "Loneliness is a terrible thing," she said softly as the fire burned lower. "But it doesn't have to be permanent." What happened next was never recorded in any official document, but Kellerman's behavior the following morning told its own story. He moved through breakfast with the satisfied expression of a man who had rediscovered reasons for living. He extended his stay by 2 additional days, despite his original urgency to reach Kentucky. Most tellingly, he began making plans to return to Millbrook Inn on his journey home to Richmond. "I've never experienced hospitality like this," he told Margaret as he prepared to leave. You and your sisters have created something truly special here. I'll be recommending this place to every traveler I meet." Margaret smiled and accepted his generous payment, nearly double the standard rate, pressed into her hands with genuine gratitude. "We look forward to your return visit, Mr. Kellerman. Safe travels." But Thomas Kellerman would never complete his journey to Kentucky. His horse was found 3 days later, wandering riderless near Cumberland Gap. Kellerman himself had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a mystery that would never be officially investigated. The assumption, logical enough for the dangerous frontier, was that he had fallen victim to bandits or wild animals. Only the Cunningham sisters knew the truth. Heinrich Zimmer had been waiting in the woods a half-mile from the inn when Kellerman departed that morning. The German immigrant was handy with tools and possessed the kind of quiet efficiency that made him valuable for tasks that required discretion. Kellerman never saw the blow that ended his life, delivered with a blacksmith's hammer to the base of his skull. His body was wrapped in canvas and buried in a predetermined location deep in the mountain forest, while his substantial purse of gold coins found its way back to Millbrook Inn. That night, the four sisters sat around their kitchen table, counting Kellerman's money and planning their future. Margaret had done the calculations. The amount they'd just acquired exceeded the inn's legitimate profits for an entire year. Catherine had proven that lonely men could be manipulated with shocking ease. Sarah had demonstrated that traces of evidence could be eliminated with the right knowledge of chemistry and mountaincraft. And Elizabeth had shown that even the most innocent-seeming person could keep terrible secrets. "He won't be missed for weeks," Margaret said, stacking the gold coins with businesslike precision. "No family, no close friends, traveling alone to a place where no one knows him. Perfect." "It was almost too easy," Catherine added, still wearing the same gentle expression she'd used to comfort their victim. "He would have given us anything we asked for." What they had discovered that cold November night was something far more valuable than gold. They had discovered how to make people disappear. The winter of 1832 gave the sisters time to refine their technique and establish the protocols that would serve them for nearly 2 decades. Margaret, with her keen business mind, developed a system for identifying ideal targets. The perfect victim was a man traveling alone, carrying substantial money, with few family connections, and no fixed schedule that would raise immediate alarm if he failed to arrive at his destination. Sarah's role evolved beyond cooking and household management. Her knowledge of mountain plants expanded to include detailed study of toxins and their effects. Pokeweed berries, when properly prepared, could induce symptoms resembling cholera. Foxglove could cause heart failure that appeared natural. Water hemlock could kill within hours while leaving little trace. She established a hidden garden behind the main house where she cultivated these plants alongside legitimate herbs, creating a pharmaceutical arsenal disguised as a medicine patch. Catherine perfected the art of emotional manipulation, learning to read men's deepest needs and present herself as the answer to their loneliness. She studied her targets carefully, adapting her personality to match their desires. For the religious, she became devoutly spiritual. For the intellectual, she transformed into a well-read conversationalist. For the grieving, she offered comfort and understanding. Her ability to become whatever a man needed was both her greatest weapon and her most chilling talent. Elizabeth, despite her youth, proved crucial to the operation's success. Her genuine-seeming innocence provided perfect cover for the family's activities. Suspicious guests found it impossible to maintain their wariness around a girl who seemed incapable of deception. She also served as the early warning system, her naturally friendly demeanor allowing her to extract information about guests' backgrounds, travel plans, and financial situations without raising suspicion. The logistics of disposal had been worked out with Germanic efficiency by the Zimmer brothers. Klaus had discovered a series of natural caves in the mountainside, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind a rockfall. Bodies could be carried there under cover of darkness and sealed behind loose stones, where the mountain's chemistry would accelerate decomposition. Personal effects were carefully sorted. Anything valuable was kept. while items that might identify the victim were buried separately or destroyed. Ezra Hawthorne's role was perhaps the most crucial. His reputation in the region was beyond reproach, and his word carried weight with local authorities. When questions were occasionally raised about missing travelers, Ezra would solemnly confirm that the individual had indeed stayed at Millbrook Inn, but had departed in good health and spirits. His weathered face and honest demeanor had never failed to satisfy even the most persistent inquirer. The spring of 1833 brought their second victim, a tobacco merchant named William Fraser from North Carolina. Fraser was transporting nearly $500 in silver coins, the proceeds from a successful season's crop sales. He was a bachelor of 38, known for his reclusive nature and his practice of making business trips alone to avoid sharing profits with partners. Fraser arrived on a rainy April evening, immediately drawn to the warmth and comfort of the inn after weeks of uncomfortable travel. The sisters deployed their refined strategy with precision. Margaret engaged him in business discussions, learning about his financial situation and travel plans. Sarah provided exceptional meals that made him reluctant to continue his journey. Elizabeth entertained him with piano music and innocent charm that reminded him of the daughter he'd never had. But it was Catherine who sealed Fraser's fate. On his third night at the inn, she found him reading alone in the common room, a leather-bound volume of poetry open on his lap. She approached with apparent shyness, asking if he might read aloud, as she had little education but loved the sound of beautiful words. For 2 hours, Fraser read to Catherine by lamplight, his voice growing stronger and more confident as she listened with rapt attention. When he finished, she placed her hand gently on his arm and told him he had the most beautiful voice she'd ever heard. The loneliness that had hardened around Fraser's heart for decades began to crack. "I've never met anyone like you," he told her, his voice thick with emotion he'd suppressed for years. "You make me feel alive again." "Then don't leave tomorrow," Catherine replied, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with perfect, calculated sincerity. "Stay another day. Let me listen to you read again." Fraser extended his stay by a week, during which Catherine gradually increased their intimacy while Sarah began introducing small amounts of pokeweed extract into his evening tea. The symptoms began subtly: mild stomach discomfort, slight dizziness, nothing alarming enough to cause immediate concern. Fraser attributed his malaise to the stress of travel and the emotional upheaval of his unexpected romantic feelings. On his final night at Millbrook Inn, Catherine invited Fraser to join her for a private dinner in her room. Sarah had prepared his favorite meal, along with a bottle of wine laced with a carefully calculated dose of water hemlock extract. As Fraser sat across from Catherine in the intimate candlelight, sharing his dreams and fears with a woman he believed might change his life forever, he had no idea he was already dying. The poison worked exactly as Sarah had predicted. Fraser's death appeared to be a sudden heart attack, brought on by excitement and overexertion. His body was discovered the next morning in Catherine's bed, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep after a night of passion. Even if a doctor had been available to examine the body, the symptoms perfectly matched those of natural cardiac failure in a middle-aged man with a previously sedentary lifestyle. Fraser was buried with appropriate solemnity in the inn's small cemetery, a final touch that Margaret had added to their operation. A proper grave, complete with a carved headstone, gave the appearance of respectful treatment while actually serving as the perfect hiding place. The cemetery contained the graves of several generations of Cunningham family members, making additional burials unremarkable to local observers. Fraser's money and valuable personal effects disappeared into the sisters' growing treasury, while his wagon and horses were sold to traveling merchants passing through weeks later. His disappearance was attributed to a decision to settle in Kentucky rather than return to North Carolina, a plausible explanation that no one thought to question too closely. By the end of 1833, the sisters had perfected a system that was virtually undetectable. They had learned to space their crimes carefully, never targeting more than 4 or 5 victims per year to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention. They developed cover stories for guests who died at the inn, ranging from heart attacks to accidents to decisions to settle permanently in the West. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, creating a conspiracy so tight that not even the slightest hint of their activities ever reached the outside world. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror at Millbrook Inn intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the Cunningham sisters were just getting started. Between 1834 and 1845, Millbrook Inn achieved a reputation that extended throughout the mid-Atlantic region and beyond. Travelers spoke of it in the same reverent tones reserved for the finest establishments in Richmond or Baltimore. The sisters had created something unprecedented, a remote mountain inn that provided luxury accommodations and service that rivaled the best urban hotels. Margaret had expanded their legitimate business operations significantly. The inn now maintained a stable of quality horses for guests, operated a small distillery producing premium mountain whiskey, and even offered guided hunting expeditions led by Ezra Hawthorne. These legal enterprises provided substantial income and, more importantly, gave the sisters a reputation as savvy businesswomen rather than simply innkeepers. The guest registry from this period, carefully preserved in the Virginia State Archives, tells the story of their success. Merchants from Charleston, politicians from Richmond, land speculators from Baltimore, and adventurers from as far away as Boston signed their names in Margaret's elegant ledger book. Many returned multiple times, becoming regular patrons who praised Millbrook Inn to their colleagues and friends. But hidden within this legitimate success was a carefully orchestrated killing machine that operated with clockwork precision. The sisters had refined their victim selection to an exact science. Catherine developed an almost supernatural ability to identify the men who would never be missed. The loners, the outcasts, the ones carrying secrets that made them avoid close relationships. Sarah's knowledge of poisons had expanded to include dozens of plant and mineral toxins, each with different symptoms and detection profiles. Elizabeth had learned to extract detailed personal information from guests through seemingly innocent conversation, and Margaret coordinated everything with the precision of a military operation. During these years, they claimed approximately 43 victims, the exact number later found by the railroad surveyor. Each death was carefully planned and executed according to strict protocols that minimized risk while maximizing profit. The sisters developed detailed profiles of their targets, sometimes observing potential victims for weeks before making their final decision. Consider the case of Jonathan Waverley, a land surveyor from Pennsylvania who arrived in September 1838. Waverley was conducting mapping work for the state government, a job that required him to travel alone through remote areas for months at a time. He carried surveying equipment worth considerable money, along with payment for his work and funds for purchasing land parcels he'd identified as investment opportunities. Margaret immediately recognized Waverley as an ideal target. His work required extended absences from civilization, meaning his disappearance might not be noticed for months. His surveying activities provided a perfect cover story. He could easily have fallen victim to any number of natural hazards while working alone in dangerous territory. Most importantly, his somewhat antisocial personality meant he had few close friends who would pursue investigations if he failed to return. The sisters began their campaign immediately. Sarah prepared special meals featuring game Waverley had watched Ezra hunt, creating a connection between the food and the rugged mountain environment he found so appealing. Elizabeth engaged him in conversations about his mapping work, expressing fascination with his technical knowledge and making him feel appreciated for his expertise. Margaret discussed potential land investments with him, positioning herself as a local expert who could help him identify profitable opportunities. But it was Catherine who provided the element that sealed Waverley's fate. She approached him not as a potential romantic conquest, but as a kindred spirit who shared his love of the wilderness. She revealed an apparently extensive knowledge of mountain flora and fauna, gleaned from years of careful study that actually served her poison research. She accompanied him on short surveying expeditions around the inn's property, demonstrating a comfort with outdoor life that Waverley found irresistible. "I've never met a woman who understood the mountains the way you do," Waverley told her during one of their excursions, his professional reserve finally cracking. "Most people see only wilderness, but you see the beauty and the order underneath." "I've lived here all my life," Catherine replied, stepping closer to him as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. "The mountains have taught me things that books never could, things about life, about death, about the balance between them." Waverley extended his planned 2-day stay into 3 weeks, ostensibly to conduct more thorough surveying work in the area, but actually because he had fallen completely under Catherine's spell. During this time, Sarah gradually introduced increasingly potent toxins into his food, creating symptoms that mimicked the early stages of mountain fever, a genuine hazard that had claimed the lives of several surveyors in recent years. The poison Sarah used for Waverley was her own innovation, an extract from destroying angel mushrooms that produced liver failure over the course of several days. The symptoms perfectly matched those of mountain fever, and even an experienced doctor would have been unlikely to distinguish between the two conditions. Waverley's death appeared to be a tragic but entirely predictable occupational hazard. His surveying equipment was sold to a merchant in Kentucky, while his detailed maps became part of Margaret's growing collection of intelligence about the region's geography and resources. His body joined the others in the sealed mountain caves, while his name was added to the local records as another victim of the dangerous frontier lifestyle. The brilliance of the sisters' operation lay not just in their killing methods, but in their ability to maintain the illusion of respectability. They attended church services in the nearby settlement of Millbrook, contributed generously to community causes, and maintained friendships with local families. Margaret served on the board of the Regional Merchants Association, while Sarah provided medical assistance to neighboring farms during times of illness. Catherine taught Sunday school to local children, and Elizabeth organized social events that brought together isolated mountain families. This community involvement served multiple purposes. It provided them with alibis and character witnesses for times when questions might be raised about missing guests. It gave them access to information about travelers passing through the region. Most importantly, it established them as pillars of the community, whose word would never be questioned by local authorities. The sisters also developed an extensive network of business relationships that helped legitimize their growing wealth. They invested in land purchases throughout the region, gradually assembling a portfolio of properties that generated rental income and appreciated in value. They loaned money to local farmers and merchants, earning both interest payments and influence within the community. They even purchased shares in several riverboat companies operating on the Ohio River, diversifying their investments while creating additional sources of income. By 1845, the Cunningham sisters were among the wealthiest landowners in Western Virginia. Their success story was held up as an example of what determined women could achieve even in the challenging frontier environment. Local newspapers occasionally featured articles about the enterprising Cunningham sisters, who had built a thriving business empire from their inherited mountain property. But beneath this facade of legitimate success lay the carefully concealed bones of more than 40 men who had made the fatal mistake of accepting the sisters' hospitality. Each death had added to their wealth and refined their methods, creating a cycle of murder and profit that seemed impossible to stop or detect. The isolation that had initially protected them from discovery now provided something even more valuable: the perfect environment for their predatory activities. Millbrook Inn had become a spider's web, beautiful and inviting on the surface but deadly to anyone who became entangled in its strands. The beginning of the end came not from law enforcement or suspicious relatives, but from an unexpected source, one of their own employees. Heinrich Zimmer, the younger of the two German brothers, had been growing increasingly unstable since a hunting accident in the fall of 1849 that left him with chronic pain and a dependence on laudanum for relief. Heinrich had always been the more sensitive of the Zimmer brothers, and the years of participating in the sisters' crimes had taken a psychological toll that his brother Klaus either ignored or failed to recognize. The laudanum, initially prescribed by Sarah for legitimate pain relief, had gradually become Heinrich's escape from the guilt and nightmares that plagued his sleep. But addiction brought its own problems: paranoia, mood swings, and a tendency toward loose talk that made him increasingly dangerous to the operation. The crisis began on a cold February morning in 1850, when Heinrich appeared at the kitchen door of the main house, his eyes wild with drug-induced panic and his clothes disheveled from a sleepless night. Sarah was alone in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for a traveling merchant from North Carolina who had arrived the previous evening, a man the sisters had already identified as their next target. "I can't do it anymore," Heinrich whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I see their faces every night. Every time I close my eyes, they're all standing there watching me. 43 men, Sarah. 43 souls crying out for justice." Sarah maintained her composure, but her mind raced as she calculated the threat Heinrich now represented. His knowledge of their crimes was complete and detailed. He could provide authorities with exact locations of burial sites, descriptions of murder methods, and testimony that would send all 4 sisters to the gallows. "You're not well, Heinrich," she said gently, moving closer to him with apparent concern. "The laudanum is affecting your mind. You're seeing things that aren't real." "No." Heinrich's voice rose dangerously, and Sarah glanced toward the ceiling, hoping the guest upstairs hadn't been awakened. "I know what we've done. I know what you've made me do. And I know it has to stop." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Heinrich alternating between tearful confessions and angry accusations, while Sarah tried to calm him without alerting the rest of the household. She eventually managed to convince him to return to his cabin with a promise that they would discuss the situation later, after he'd had time to rest and clear his head. But Sarah knew there would be no later discussion. Heinrich Zimmer had become a liability that threatened everything they'd built, and liabilities had to be eliminated. That evening, after their guest had retired for the night, Sarah prepared a special dinner for the Zimmer brothers, a gesture of appreciation for their years of loyal service, she explained to Klaus. The meal featured Heinrich's favorite dishes, along with Sarah's special spiced wine that contained enough concentrated foxglove extract to stop a man's heart within hours. Heinrich died quietly in his sleep that night, his death attributed to the same heart condition that had supposedly claimed several of their guests over the years. Klaus, who had consumed less of the poisoned wine due to his natural temperance, survived, but with significant cardiac damage that left him weakened and dependent on Sarah's medical care. Heinrich's death solved their immediate problem, but created new challenges. Klaus, despite his physical weakness, began asking pointed questions about his brother's sudden demise. The similarities between Heinrich's symptoms and those exhibited by several of their guests had not escaped his notice, and his loyalty to the sisters was wavering under the weight of suspicion and grief. Margaret recognized that their operation was entering a critical phase. The network of trust and complicity that had protected them for nearly 2 decades was beginning to fracture, and any significant investigation would uncover evidence that even their considerable influence couldn't suppress. She began making contingency plans for the possibility that they might need to abandon Millbrook Inn entirely. The final guest to die at Millbrook Inn was Samuel Hartwell, a cotton broker from Savannah who arrived in March 1851 with over $1,000 in gold coins and banknotes. Hartwell was a widower in his 50s, traveling north to negotiate contracts with textile mills in Pennsylvania. His death followed the sisters' established pattern: apparent heart failure after several days of exceptional hospitality that included intimate companionship with Catherine. But Hartwell's death marked a crucial change in the sisters' methodology. For the first time in nearly 20 years, they made a significant mistake. Hartwell had arranged to meet a business associate in Pittsburgh on a specific date, and when he failed to appear, his colleague began making inquiries that eventually reached local authorities in Virginia. Sheriff Thomas Brennan of Millbrook County was a capable lawman with over 20 years of experience, but he had never encountered anything like the Cunningham sisters' operation. His initial investigation was routine. A few questions to confirm that Hartwell had indeed stayed at the inn and departed in good health. Margaret and Ezra provided their usual testimony, supported by carefully maintained guest records that showed Hartwell's departure date and intended destination. But Brennan was more persistent than previous inquirers, and his investigation began uncovering small inconsistencies in the sisters' story. A blacksmith in the next county remembered shoeing a horse that matched the description of Hartwell's mount, but several days after the businessman was supposed to have passed through the area. A merchant recalled purchasing supplies from someone who resembled Hartwell, but again the timing didn't match the official departure date from Millbrook Inn. These discrepancies were minor and might have been explained by any number of innocent factors, but they were enough to plant seeds of doubt in Brennan's mind. He began looking more closely at other missing persons cases involving travelers who had last been seen in the Millbrook Inn area, and the pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. Sheriff Brennan's investigation accelerated rapidly once he began examining the broader pattern of disappearances around Millbrook Inn. His review of county records revealed that over the past 20 years, at least 15 different missing persons cases had involved travelers who were last confirmed to be staying at the Cunningham property. While individual cases could be explained by the various hazards of frontier travel, the statistical clustering was impossible to ignore. Brennan was careful not to alert the sisters to his investigation, conducting his inquiries discreetly and avoiding direct contact with anyone connected to the inn. His breakthrough came when he interviewed Klaus Zimmer during one of the German immigrants' rare trips to town for supplies. Klaus, still grieving his brother's death and increasingly suspicious about the circumstances surrounding it, proved more talkative than usual. "My brother Heinrich. He was troubled before he died," Klaus told Brennan during what appeared to be a casual conversation outside the general store. "He spoke of things that kept him awake at night. The mountains hold many secrets, Sheriff, and not all of them should stay buried." This cryptic statement might have meant nothing to a less experienced investigator, but Brennan recognized the signs of a man struggling with dangerous knowledge. He arranged a private meeting with Klaus at a location far from Millbrook Inn, where the full truth finally began to emerge. Klaus's confession was halting and incomplete. Years of fear and loyalty struggled against guilt and suspicion as he revealed fragments of what he knew. He couldn't bring himself to explicitly accuse the sisters of murder, but he provided enough details about mysterious late-night activities, unexplained burials, and his brother's growing distress to give Brennan the evidence he needed to obtain search warrants. The raid on Millbrook Inn was conducted at dawn on April 15, 1851, with a force of 8 armed deputies surrounding the property to prevent escape. Brennan had coordinated with federal marshals to ensure that any evidence found would be properly handled, recognizing that the case might involve crimes across state lines. The sisters met the arrival of law enforcement with characteristic composure. Margaret greeted Brennan at the front door with polite concern, expressing hope that she could assist with whatever investigation had brought him to their property. Catherine appeared genuinely distressed by the suggestion that anything improper might have occurred at their respectable establishment. Sarah offered to prepare refreshments for the officers, while Elizabeth seemed confused and frightened by the accusations being leveled against her family. But their practiced performances couldn't conceal the physical evidence that 20 years of murder had left behind. The search of the main house revealed several items that clearly belonged to missing travelers. A distinctive silver pocket watch engraved with Samuel Hartwell's initials, a leather portfolio containing business documents belonging to Thomas Kellerman, and a collection of personal letters and photographs that represented dozens of different victims. More damning still was Sarah's carefully maintained garden of poisonous plants, which included several species that had no legitimate medicinal applications. Her collection of books on botany and chemistry revealed an expertise in toxicology that went far beyond the knowledge required for normal household remedies. Hidden in her private room, investigators found detailed notes describing the effects and dosages of various plant toxins, along with records that clearly corresponded to the deaths of specific guests. The discovery of the burial caves was the final piece of evidence needed to confirm the scope of the sisters' crimes. Klaus, facing charges as an accessory to murder, led investigators to the concealed entrance behind the rockfall. Inside the caves, exactly as the railroad surveyor would find them months later, were the skeletal remains of 43 men, along with personal effects worth thousands of dollars. Each skeleton told its own story of violent death. The puncture wounds found at the base of several skulls indicated that some victims had been killed quickly with sharp instruments, likely while they were unconscious from poison or alcohol. Others showed signs of strangulation or suffocation. A few appeared to have died from poison alone, their bones showing the chemical changes associated with heavy metal toxicity. The trial of the Cunningham sisters became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Virginia history. Newspapers throughout the country covered the case, fascinated by the story of 4 women who had operated one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth's attorney Daniel Hutchinson, presented overwhelming evidence of a conspiracy that had lasted nearly 20 years and claimed more than 40 lives. Margaret maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, claiming that any evidence found at the inn had been planted by enemies seeking to destroy their family's reputation. Catherine broke down completely during her testimony, alternating between denials and tearful confessions that implicated all 4 sisters in the murders. Sarah refused to speak at all, maintaining a stoic silence that many interpreted as an admission of guilt. Elizabeth, the youngest and most sympathetic defendant, claimed to have been coerced by her older sisters and begged for mercy from the court. The defense strategy focused on the isolation and vulnerability of 4 orphaned women, trying to survive in a dangerous frontier environment. The sisters' attorney, Marcus Fairfield, argued that they had been driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond their control, and that their youth and gender should be considered as mitigating factors in their sentencing. But the overwhelming evidence and the shocking scope of their crimes made any sympathy difficult to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts for all 4 defendants on multiple counts of murder in the first degree. The sentencing was swift and final. Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah were condemned to hang, their execution scheduled for October 12, 1851. Elizabeth, largely due to her age at the time the crimes began and her apparent cooperation with authorities, received a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The executions were carried out as scheduled on a grey October morning, with hundreds of spectators gathering to witness the end of the Cunningham sisters' story. Margaret faced her death with the same cold composure she had shown throughout the trial, offering no final words of remorse or explanation. Catherine and Sarah stood together on the scaffold, holding hands as the nooses were placed around their necks, their final moment of sisterly solidarity, a stark contrast to the calculated cruelty they had shown their victims. Elizabeth Cunningham was transported to the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond, where she would spend the remaining 37 years of her life. Prison records indicate that she maintained her innocence until her death in 1888, claiming repeatedly that she had been a victim of her sister's manipulation rather than a willing participant in their crimes. She never received visitors and left no written account of her experiences at Millbrook Inn. Klaus Zimmer, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, disappeared shortly after the trial concluded. Some reports placed him in Ohio, others in Missouri, but he was never officially located again. The trauma of his brother's death and his role in exposing the sisters' crimes appeared to have broken him completely, leaving him unable to settle anywhere or form lasting relationships. Ezra Hawthorne faced charges as an accessory to murder, but his advanced age and his cooperation with authorities earned him a reduced sentence of 10 years in prison. He died in custody in 1854, reportedly still maintaining that he had never suspected the true nature of the sisters' activities and had believed their explanations for the various deaths and disappearances. Millbrook Inn itself was sold at auction to satisfy legal judgments against the Cunningham estate. The new owners, a family named Fletcher from Richmond, attempted to continue operating it as a legitimate inn, but the property's notorious reputation made it impossible to attract guests. The building stood empty for several years before being purchased by a mining company that demolished the structures and converted the land to industrial use. The copper mine where the victims' remains were discovered was permanently sealed by order of the court, with a simple stone marker erected to commemorate the 43 men who died at Millbrook Inn. The marker, which still stands today according to local historical societies, bears only the inscription, "Here lie unknown travelers, 1832-1851. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life." The case had far-reaching implications for inn and hotel regulation throughout Virginia and neighboring states. New laws were enacted requiring more detailed guest registration procedures, mandatory reporting of guest deaths to local authorities, and regular inspections of establishments serving travelers. The Cunningham laws, as they became known, remained in effect well into the 20th century. Perhaps most significantly, the Millbrook Inn case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the potential for evil to flourish in places far from civilized oversight. Criminal investigators began paying closer attention to patterns of disappearances around remote establishments, leading to the discovery of several smaller-scale operations that might otherwise have continued undetected. The financial investigation revealed the true scope of the sisters' success. Their estate, including land holdings, business investments, and liquid assets, was valued at over $50,000. An enormous fortune for the time period. The money was used to compensate victims' families where possible and to fund improvements to law enforcement capabilities in remote areas of Virginia. Modern criminologists who have studied the case note several factors that contributed to the sisters' remarkable success. Their operation combined careful victim selection, sophisticated killing methods, excellent disposal techniques, and most importantly, a perfect cover story that made their crimes nearly invisible to contemporary investigators. The isolation of their location provided privacy for their activities, while their reputation for hospitality created a steady stream of potential victims. The psychological profiles developed by modern experts suggest that Margaret was the primary architect of the operation, possessing the antisocial personality traits and organizational skills necessary to plan and execute such a complex criminal enterprise. Catherine likely suffered from what would now be recognized as borderline personality disorder, making her capable of forming intense but ultimately meaningless emotional connections with victims. Sarah's expertise with poisons suggests a fascination with death and control that bordered on sadistic. Elizabeth's role remains the most ambiguous. Whether she was a willing participant or a coerced accomplice may never be definitively determined. What makes the Millbrook Inn case particularly chilling is how easily it could have continued indefinitely. Had Heinrich Zimmer not suffered his psychological breakdown, or had Sheriff Brennan been less persistent in his investigation, the sisters might have continued their activities for decades longer. The randomness of their ultimate discovery serves as a reminder that many historical crimes may have gone completely undetected, their perpetrators taking their secrets to unmarked graves. The story of the Cunningham sisters also highlights the vulnerability of travelers in the pre-industrial era. When communication was slow and transportation was dangerous, a man could disappear between two towns and not be missed for months, if ever. The sisters exploited this vulnerability with ruthless efficiency, turning the hospitality industry itself into a weapon against the lonely and isolated. Local folklore in Western Virginia preserved distorted versions of the Millbrook Inn story for generations. Some tales portrayed the sisters as victims of circumstance who were driven to desperate measures by poverty and isolation. Others transformed them into supernatural entities who lured victims through magical means rather than simple manipulation. The truth, as revealed by court records and contemporary accounts, is both more mundane and more terrifying than any ghost story. The physical location of Millbrook Inn remained a source of local superstition well into the 20th century. Hunters and hikers reported finding unusual artifacts in the area: old buttons, pieces of clothing, rusted metal objects that might once have belonged to the sisters' victims. Whether these discoveries were genuine relics or simply the products of overactive imaginations influenced by the location's notorious history remains unknown. Several attempts were made over the years to locate additional burial sites that might contain victims who were disposed of through other methods. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s identified several soil anomalies consistent with unmarked graves, but legal and ethical considerations prevented extensive excavation. The possibility remains that the 43 victims found in the mine represent only a portion of the sisters' total kill count. The Cunningham case file, housed in the Virginia State Archives, continues to attract researchers and amateur historians fascinated by one of America's most successful serial killing operations. The detailed records kept by Margaret Cunningham, combined with Sarah's botanical notes, and the physical evidence recovered from the property, provide an unusually complete picture of how such crimes were planned and executed in the 19th century. This mystery shows us how easily evil can hide behind a facade of respectability and how isolation can provide the perfect cover for the most heinous crimes. The story of the Cunningham sisters serves as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like charming hostesses offering weary travelers exactly what they need most. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or might there be more secrets buried in those Virginia mountains? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think really happened at Millbrook Inn. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past is full of dark secrets waiting to be uncovered, and I'll be here to help you discover them. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter from America's hidden history of terror.